My name is Maren Voss. I'm 30, and I was standing in the middle of a restored 920 seconds ballroom on the Seattle waterfront when my future mother-in-law asked, in front of the venue's events coordinator and 2 staff members, whether I actually understood what I was getting myself into. I looked up the pricing for this place, Patrice said, holding her phone up like evidence. It's not cheap, Colin. I don't think Maren's little drawing job covers something like this. Nobody in that room knew. I'd walked through buildings like this one, professionally for 8 years. Nobody knew that 4 years earlier, I'd led design on a $340 million waterfront redevelopment project, 2 blocks from where we were standing. Patrice certainly didn't know it. She'd decided who I was the day she met me, and she'd never once bothered to update the file. It was a gray Saturday in April, the kind of overcast Seattle morning that makes old brick look almost silver, and we'd been touring the Hensley room for maybe 15 minutes. Exposed brick walls, a restored tin ceiling, arched windows tall enough to flood the whole space with light even under clouds. Colin had picked it with his mother's help, both of them agreeing it photographed like money, before we'd spent a single dollar on flowers. The events coordinator, a woman named Delphine, glanced at me with the specific, practiced neutrality of someone who'd witnessed 100 family tensions unfold across this same restored tin ceiling and had learned not to react to any of them. Colin said, "Mom," in the tired voice of a man who'd had this exact conversation more times than he could count. He didn't correct her. He redirected the way he always did, toward the catering kitchen, the parking situation, anything that wasn't the actual math of who could afford what. I stayed quiet. I'd learned 3 years earlier that correcting Patrice in real time never landed. She'd nod, absorb it politely, and repeat the same assumption 2 weeks later, like the correction had simply evaporated. So I'd stopped correcting her. I let her keep the version of me that was easiest for her to hold, because fighting for accuracy every single time had started to feel like more work than it was worth. And because every previous attempt had cost me more emotional energy than it ever seemed to return. What none of us knew yet was that the walkthrough wasn't finished. And the man about to walk through the side door was going to make sure Patrice never got to keep that version of me again. Delphine finished the tour of the bridal suite and ran through the vendor list, and Patrice asked, not quite under her breath, whether a smaller venue might make more sense given everyone's actual budget. I watched the gray afternoon light fall through the arched windows and said nothing, the way I'd said nothing, through 3 years of comments exactly like it. Then the side door opened. A man in a gray wool coat crossed the ballroom floor with the unhurried confidence of someone who owned the building rather than worked in it, which, as it turned out, he did. Delphine mentioned a walkthrough today, he said, extending a hand to the group before his gaze landed on me and stopped. Warren Ashcroft. I own the Hensley room along with 2 other properties on this block. He paused, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition that hadn't been there a second earlier. Wait, you're Maren Voss, Voss Architecture. You did the concept work on the waterfront redevelopment. The room went still in a way that felt entirely different from the stillness Patrice's comment had created 20 minutes earlier. That's me, I said. I sat on the community advisory board during your public comment sessions, Warren said. Your testimony on shoreline preservation was the best planning presentation I've heard in 15 years on that board. I own a residential unit in one of the towers your firm designed. I've been telling people about your work for over a year, and I never expected to meet you standing in my own ballroom. Beside me, Patrice had gone completely still. I own my firm outright, I said, before anyone else could fill the silence. I led design on a $340 million public project, 2 blocks from here. I could book this venue for the next 3 years without touching a dollar of Colin's income. I looked at Patrice directly for the first time in that conversation. You've called it a little drawing job for 3 years. It was never that. Warren's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly not expecting to have walked into the middle of exactly this conversation. But he didn't retreat from it, either. I'd be glad to walk you through the building's structural history sometime, he said to me. Architect to owner, I have the original 1923 blueprints archived downstairs, along with survey work from an 80s renovation that never got documented anywhere. Public. I'd like that, I said. Patrice's face moved through 3 distinct expressions in the span of about 4 seconds. Defensiveness, confusion, and finally something that looked like a woman recalculating an entire narrative in real time and not liking a single number she was arriving at. She didn't apologize. She didn't say anything at all. She just stood there, phone still in her hand, the pricing page she'd pulled up still glowing on the screen, suddenly irrelevant. Colin looked between his mother and me, and for the first time since I'd known him, I watched him actually notice the moment instead of trying to manage his way past it. He didn't say anything either, not yet, but something in his posture had changed, the way a person's shoulders shift when they finally see a piece of furniture. They've been walking around for years. Delphine, to her credit, kept moving the walkthrough forward, with the practiced grace of someone who'd learned to steer through far worse family tension than this. She showed us the loading dock access for florists, walked through the noise ordinance cutoff for the reception, mentioned the preferred parking valet company. Patrice nodded along mechanically, asking none of her earlier pointed questions about pricing tiers, her earlier confidence visibly deflated. I'd spent 8 years building toward a moment I never once imagined would look exactly like this. Not a boardroom presentation, not a ribbon cutting, just an ordinary Saturday walkthrough, where a stranger said my name out loud, and, in doing so, dismantled 3 years of careful, deliberate misunderstanding in under 90 seconds. I didn't yet know how much more of that misunderstanding was about to unravel over the following months, or how directly it would end up connecting to the very room we were standing in. We finished the walkthrough in near silence. Patrice asked no more questions about budget. Delphine walked us to the door, and Warren shook my hand again on the way out, telling me to call his office directly whenever I wanted access to the archives. Colin didn't say much in the elevator down. Neither did I. There was too much sitting in the silence to try to talk through it standing up. So instead we just stood side by side, watching the floor numbers count down, both of us privately rearranging something that had just quietly rearranged itself without either of us fully choosing it. Out on the sidewalk, Patrice hugged Colin goodbye first, then turned to me and said, stiffly, that was quite a coincidence, not an apology, not even an acknowledgement, just a word. Coincidence. As if the last 3 years could be filed away under bad luck instead of a choice she'd made and remade every time an opportunity to ask. A real question had come and gone unused. I didn't know yet that the walkthrough humiliation wasn't the worst thing Patrice had done that week. I wouldn't find that out for another 11 days when Warren's office called my studio with a question that had nothing to do with blueprints and everything to do with a phone call. Someone claiming to be me had made to his events team 3 weeks earlier, a call I had never made, about a cancellation I had never requested. 11 days after the walkthrough, Warren's office called my studio directly. Not Warren himself, his events director, a precise, slightly cautious woman named Iris, who said she was following up on the change request before catching herself and asking whether I'd actually made one. What change request? I said. Someone called our booking line 3 weeks ago, Iris said, identifying herself as the bride, asking to downgrade the Voss-Whitfield wedding from the full ballroom package to the smaller mezzanine space, and to move the date up by 2 months to a Tuesday in September, which qualifies for our off-peak rate. She said it was a budget adjustment. The couple had discussed privately and wanted handled quietly before the groom's mother found out, since apparently there'd been some tension about costs. I sat very still at my drafting table, the phone pressed to my ear, running the timeline in my head. 3 weeks ago. That was nearly a full week before the walkthrough, where Patrice had stood in that ballroom asking whether we could actually afford it. The same ballroom someone had apparently already tried to quietly downgrade us out of, in my name, without my knowledge. I never made that call, I said. Iris was quiet for a moment. We didn't process the change, she said carefully. Our policy requires a secondary verification for any booking modification, a callback to the number on file, which is your fiancé's number, not the one the caller used. When we couldn't verify, we flagged the request and moved on, assuming it was resolved on your end. I only found it because Warren asked me to double-check something after the walkthrough, given who you turned out to be. I wanted to confirm before I said anything further, in case there's a simple explanation. There wasn't a simple explanation. There was exactly one explanation, and I already knew what it was. If you've ever discovered that a small, private betrayal had been sitting quietly in the background of your life for weeks before you finally found out, you know exactly the specific cold feeling I felt, sitting at that drafting table. I asked Iris if she still had the caller ID on record from that call. She did. It wasn't blocked, wasn't a burner number, wasn't anything sophisticated. It was Patrice's cell phone, the same number saved in my contacts as Colin's mom, the same number that had texted me a cheerful good morning message just that week about seeding chart ideas. I didn't call Colin immediately. I sat with it first, the way I sat with everything significant before deciding how to hold it, turning over the specific shape of what Patrice had actually done. This wasn't simply an outdated assumption about my career, absorbed carelessly over years of not asking questions. This was active. She had picked up her phone, called a venue directly, impersonated me, and attempted to unilaterally shrink our wedding down to something smaller and cheaper, timed exactly 1 week before standing in that same ballroom and publicly questioning whether we could afford it, as if she were building the case for her own manufactured downgrade in advance. I sat there long enough that the light through my studio windows shifted from afternoon gray to early evening, tracing the specific mechanics of what she'd have needed to know to make that call convincing. Our wedding date, the venue's booking reference, enough detail about the mezzanine space to request it specifically by name, which meant she'd toured it herself at some point, quietly, without ever mentioning it to either of us. I thought about how many small, unremarkable moments over the past few months might have contained pieces of this plan, without my noticing, conversations I'd taken at face value, that had likely been reconnaissance the entire time. That evening, I drove to Colin's apartment instead of calling. Some conversations needed to happen in person, where I could watch his face while I said it. Your mother called the venue 3 weeks ago, I said, once we were both sitting at his kitchen table. She pretended to be me. She tried to downgrade our wedding to the mezzanine space and move the date to a cheaper off-peak Tuesday, without telling either of us. Colin's expression shifted through something I hadn't seen from him before, not the tired, conflict-avoidant patience he usually wore around his mother's comments, but something sharper, closer to genuine anger. She what? I walked him through everything Iris had told me, the caller ID, the verification callback that had failed, the specific timeline that put the fake call a full week before the walkthrough, where Patrice had stood in that same ballroom, questioning our budget out loud, as though she were laying groundwork for a downgrade she'd already tried and failed to execute quietly. She's been telling everyone she's worried about us overspending, Colin said slowly, working through it out loud. She told my aunt at Easter that she thought the venue was excessive. I thought it was just her being her. I didn't think she'd actually try to change it behind our backs. I want to see the call log myself, Colin said after a moment. Not because I don't believe you. Because I need to hear it confirmed directly. And then I need to talk to her myself, without you having to be the one to say it to her face. I appreciated that more than I expected to. For 3 years, Colin had managed his mother's comfort by redirecting every uncomfortable conversation away from confrontation. This was the first time I'd heard him propose walking directly into one. There's something else, I said. Iris mentioned the caller specifically said. She wanted it handled quietly before you found out. Not before I found out. Before you did. Which means whatever she's actually trying to control here, it's not really about the money. It's about not wanting either of us to know she was managing things behind the scenes. Colin sat with that, for a long moment, turning his water glass slowly on the table, the same absent gesture his father made when working through something difficult. I think, he said finally, my mother has spent years, assuming she still gets to make decisions for me, quietly, without asking, because it's always been easier than actually negotiating with me directly. I think this is the same instinct that made her call me the successful one's mother, at every dinner, and treat your career like a rumor. She doesn't ask. She decides, and then she manages around whatever she's decided until someone catches her. He called Warren's office the next morning himself without me on the line and asked for a copy of the call record to be sent directly to him. Then he called his mother and told her, calmly, and without raising his voice, that he knew about the call to the venue and that they needed to talk about it in person before the wedding, before anything else got quietly rearranged behind his back again. Patrice, according to Colin, went quiet on the other end of the line for a long time before answering. She didn't deny it. She didn't ask how he'd found out. She simply said, "We should talk this weekend." In a voice Colin described afterward as smaller than he'd ever heard from her. The voice of someone who understood immediately, and without needing it spelled out exactly how much ground had just shifted underneath her. He told me later that the call ended almost abruptly after that, as if she needed to get off the phone before she said something she couldn't take back, and that the silence on her end, in those final seconds, had felt heavier than anything she could have actually said. Patrice asked to meet at her house that Saturday, not a restaurant, not neutral ground. Colin drove us both over, and I noticed his hands stayed steady on the wheel the entire way. None of the usual tension I'd seen in him before difficult conversations with his mother. Harold answered the door and led us into the living room, without much conversation. The specific quiet of a man who already knew something significant was about to happen, and had decided his job was simply to stay out of the way of it. Patrice was sitting in her usual chair by the window, a folder on the side table beside her, which struck me as strange, until I realized, a few minutes later, that it contained printouts of the wedding budget. She'd apparently been tracking independently for months. Line items, vendor estimates, comparison pricing for venues. We'd never even discussed evidence of exactly how long this had been sitting in her mind before it turned into a phone call. The folder itself felt like a small confession, before anyone had said a single word. "I want to say this before either of you says anything." Patrice started, her voice tighter than usual. "I called the venue. I did request the downgrade. I used Marin's name because I knew they wouldn't take the request seriously from me, and I told myself it wasn't really lying, just handling something practically before it became a bigger problem." "Practically," Colin repeated, not quite a question, more a statement of disbelief. "I've watched this wedding balloon into something I didn't recognize," Patrice said. Every conversation about it felt like it was moving further away from anything I understood or had any say in. I thought if I could just quietly bring it back down to something more manageable, everyone would eventually be relieved and nobody would even need to know I'd been the one who did it. I sat with that for a moment, watching her work through her own justification in real time. The way people do when they're hearing their reasoning out loud for the first time, and discovering it doesn't sound the way it did in their head. "You didn't call because you thought it was too expensive," I said. "You called because you wanted control over something you felt was slipping away from you, and impersonating me was the fastest way to get it without having to negotiate with either of us directly." Patrice's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue the point. "I've never felt like I had a real say in this wedding," she said instead. "Colin picked the venue with input from you. The date, the guest list, all of it happened around me, instead of with me. I know that's not an excuse for what I did. I'm just telling you where it came from. If you've ever had someone justify a real betrayal by pointing to a feeling that was genuinely theirs to have, but never theirs to act on this way, you already understand exactly how uncomfortable that kind of honesty is to sit through." "Mom," Colin said, and something in his voice made both Patrice and I turn to look at him directly. "I need you to hear this clearly, because I'm not going to say it more than once. You don't get a say in decisions Marin and I make about our own wedding. Not because I don't value your opinion, but because it stopped being a request for input the moment you called a venue and pretended to be my fiancé to override a decision you didn't agree with. That's not feeling unheard. That's taking something that wasn't yours to take." Patrice's eyes went glassy, though she didn't fully cry. "I know," she said quietly. "I've spent 3 years smoothing things over every time you dismissed Marin's career, every time you asked whether we could afford things, every time you made a comment that made her smaller in front of other people." Colin continued. his voice steady in a way I'd genuinely never heard from him before. I told myself I was keeping the peace. I wasn't. I was letting you keep doing it, because it was easier for me than actually standing up to you. That's on me. But this. He gestured toward the folder on the side table. This is different. This isn't a dismissive comment I let slide. This is you actively trying to take control of something that belongs to us, and lying to a business to do it. Harold, sitting quietly in the corner chair, finally spoke. Patrice, I think you need to actually answer him. Not explain, answer. It was the most I'd ever heard Harold say in a single moment across 3 years of family dinners, and the fact that he chose this exact moment to say it told me something about how seriously he was taking what had happened. Even Colin looked briefly surprised at his father's directness, as if he'd forgotten Harold was capable of it. Patrice looked down at her hands for a long moment, turning her wedding ring slowly. An old nervous habit I recognized from years of watching her do it during uncomfortable conversations at family gatherings. You're right, she said finally, looking up at Colin, then at me. It wasn't my decision to make, and I made it anyway, and I told myself a story about why that was okay. I'm sorry, I don't expect that to fix it today. I just need you both to know I understand what I actually did, not just how you're both reacting to it. It wasn't a complete resolution. I didn't feel the specific, satisfying click of a story wrapping up neatly, because real ones rarely do. But something had genuinely shifted in that living room. Not just an apology, but Patrice actually naming, out loud, the difference between feeling excluded and taking unilateral action to fix that feeling without anyone's consent. Those were two different problems, and for the first time in 3 years, she seemed to actually understand that distinction, instead of collapsing them into a single, defensible complaint. I'm going to call Warren's office myself this week, Patrice said, unprompted. I want to apologize to them directly, and I want to make sure there's nothing outstanding that needs correcting on the account, since I was the one who created the confusion in the first place. Colin looked at me, and I gave a small nod, not full trust yet, but something adjacent to willingness to see what she actually did next, rather than just what she said in this one difficult conversation. We left an hour later. Nobody hugged goodbye the way the family usually did. Instead, Patrice walked us to the door and said, simply, "Thank you both for coming instead of just handling this over the phone." It was a small thing, but it was the first time in years I'd heard her acknowledge that a conversation with me deserved the same weight and directness she'd give anyone else. In the car, Colin was quiet for a long stretch before he said, I don't know if that fixes anything permanently, but I needed her to hear it from me directly, not filtered through you, having to explain it to her again. He glanced over at me at the next stop sign. I think I've spent so long being the buffer between you two that I forgot I was supposed to actually be your partner in it, not just a translator managing both sides. You did that today, I said. That's the part that actually mattered. He reached over and took my hand at the next red light, and, for the first time since the venue walkthrough, 3 weeks earlier, I let myself believe that whatever came next between Patrice and me might actually be built on something more honest than 3 years of quiet, unspoken accommodation. I didn't know yet whether her follow-through would match her words. I only knew that for the first time, she'd actually named the truth out loud, in front of both of us, without deflecting it into an explanation designed to make herself feel better instead of make things right. Whatever came next, at least it would be built on that. The wedding was 3 months later in the Hensley room, exactly as originally planned. Patrice called Warren's office herself, 2 days after our conversation at her house, apologized directly to Iris for the impersonation, and asked what she could do to make it right. Warren, when he mentioned it to me weeks later, said it was one of the more genuine apologies he'd received from a client's family member in 20 years running events at that venue. Mostly because Patrice hadn't tried to minimize what she'd done or explain it away. She'd simply owned it, plainly, and asked what repair looked like. What repair looked like, as it turned out, was Patrice quietly taking over the guest list coordination. A genuinely useful task she handled with real competence, and something Colin and I actually needed help with in the final stretch before the wedding. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was just consistent, small, correct behavior. repeated over 12 weeks, the specific kind of proof that means more than any single apology ever could. On the morning of the wedding, I stood in the Hensley room's bridal suite, the same room Delphine had shown us during that first walkthrough, watching the light come through the arched windows. The way it had that gray April morning. Except now, the sky was clear and the whole ballroom below was filling, with white folding chairs and low arrangements of white ranunculus along the restored's tin ceiling sightlines. Patris knocked and came in alone, dressed for the wedding but early, before the rest of the bridal party had arrived. "I wanted a minute before it got busy," she said, standing near the doorway rather than sitting down, as if she wasn't sure she'd earned the right to settle in comfortably. "Okay," I said. "I've been thinking about what to say if I got a chance to toast tonight," she said, and I realized I didn't actually know enough about your work to say anything true. So I looked it up. All of it, the waterfront project, the hotel renovation before it, the advisory board testimony Warren mentioned. She paused. I understood maybe half the technical language. But I understood enough to know I spent 3 years calling something remarkable. A little drawing job, and I understood enough to know that wasn't really about your career at all. It was about me deciding who you were before I'd bothered to actually find out. "I'm not asking you to forget the phone call," Patrice continued. "I know that's separate, and I know it's going to take longer than 12 weeks of helping with a guest list to rebuild trust. I just wanted you to know before today that I see it now. All of it, not just the part where I got caught. It was the most complete, unflinching thing she'd said to me in 3 years. No qualifying, no redirecting toward her own feelings of exclusion. Thank you for saying that," I said. "All of it, not just the parts that were easy." She nodded, eyes bright, and left the room without pushing for more, which itself felt like evidence she'd actually learned something. The ceremony happened in the ballroom. An hour later, Warren seated near the back as a guest rather than a vendor, watching the space he'd spent decades restoring hold something. He later told me he considered one of the better uses it had seen in years. Colin's vows included a line I hadn't expected. A direct acknowledgement, in front of both families, that he'd spent years managing conflict by avoiding it, and that the person standing across from him had taught him, this year specifically, what it actually looked like to choose someone clearly, instead of just quietly, comfortably, by default. Harold, seated in the front row, wiped his eyes discreetly during that part. At the reception, before the toasts began, Warren approached Patrice near the edge of the dance floor. I wasn't part of that conversation, but Colin was standing close enough to hear it, and he told me afterward, almost word for word, what Warren had said. "I don't know if Marin's ever mentioned this," Warren said to her, "but this building almost wasn't standing for this wedding at all. The original waterfront redevelopment plan called for demolishing this entire block, including the Hensley room. Full clearance, new construction, nothing preserved. I fought that plan for 2 years on the advisory board and kept losing. It was Marin's testimony and the preservation overlay she wrote directly into her firm's design proposal that got this specific block excluded from demolition. She did that 4 years ago, long before she ever met your son, long before she had any idea she'd someday be standing in this room getting married. I've never told her how personally that mattered to me, because I didn't want it to feel like I was thanking her for something owed. But I think you should know it given everything else you're learning about her today." Colin said Patrice went very still, the way she had during the walkthrough. Months earlier, except this time, there was no defensiveness in it. Only the particular quiet of someone, absorbing something too large to respond to immediately. She hadn't just misjudged a successful woman's career. She had spent 3 years dismissing the specific traceable reason the room her son was getting married in still existed at all. She found me a few minutes later, near the edge of the dance floor before her toast. "Warren just told me about the preservation overlay," she said. "About this building. I had no idea that was you specifically. I read about the shoreline work last weekend and didn't even make that connection." She shook her head slowly. "I keep thinking I've finally understood the full size of what I missed, and then I find out there's more of it. I didn't design it thinking about a wedding someday," I said. "I designed it because the block deserved to survive, and because gutting it for a cleaner, modern build would have erased something worth keeping. It happened to also mean something personal later. That part was luck, not planning. Maybe, Patrice said, but I think I needed to hear both parts today. Not just that you're accomplished somewhere far away from me, that your work has been sitting right here, holding up the room we're standing in, the whole time I was underestimating you in it. At the reception, Patrice gave her toast. She kept it short, direct, and specific. No vague sentimentality, no generic mother-in-law platitudes. She named the waterfront project by title. She described in rough but accurate terms the shoreline preservation work I'd fought for during the public approval process. She said plainly, in front of nearly 100 people, that she'd spent 3 years underestimating her daughter-in-law, and that the last 12 weeks had taught her exactly how much that underestimation had cost, and that she intended to spend considerably longer making up for it than it had taken her to cause it. It wasn't a dramatic, tearful spectacle. It was measured and specific, the kind of apology that comes from someone who's actually done the work, rather than someone performing contrition for an audience. Warren, from his table near the back, caught my eye afterward, and gave a small, approving nod, the particular look of a man who recognized competence and honesty when he saw them, whether in architecture or in an apology. I didn't win that year by being louder than Patrice, or by delivering some devastating public confrontation that humiliated her the way she'd once humiliated me. I won it by continuing to do the work I'd always done, quietly and well, until the truth became impossible to keep misunderstanding, and by finally, with Colin's help, insisting that accuracy mattered more than anyone's comfort, including my own. My name is Maren Voss, and that was my story. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who mattered to you, know this. The truth doesn't need permission to eventually be seen clearly. But sometimes it needs someone standing beside you, willing to say it out loud, when you're tired of saying it alone. If this story meant something to you, please like, comment, and subscribe to Shadow Drama Stories. We've got more stories just like this one waiting for you, and I promise the next one hits just as hard. See you in the next one.